This is Popular Front, a podcast focused on the niche details of modern warfare and underreported conflict with me, Jake Hanrahan. This episode, we're speaking to journalist Matt Kynaston. He's going to be talking to us about the recent gun battles in al-Hilweh, the biggest Palestinian refugee camp in Lebanon. Recently, there's been serious conflict between two different factions, Fatah and a jihadist faction in the camp. The area is controlled by various different Palestinian paramilitary groups. The Lebanese military has nothing to do with the place. And in the midst of this recent urban warfare, many civilians have been hurt and killed. Support Popular Front at patreon.com/popularfront. Before we get into the recent conflicts in al-Hilweh, maybe let's explain what this place actually is and how it came to be, because it's kind of obscure in a way for people not particularly plugged into war and conflict, and even maybe for people that are. I think it's one of those places that it's often under the radar, but when it goes off, it causes a lot of trouble. So yeah, just tell us, what is this place?
So al-Hilweh is the largest refugee camp for Palestinians in Lebanon. It was established by the ICRC, the International Council of Red Cross, in 1948 after the Nakba, which is where hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were exiled or expelled from Palestine. Palestinian society was essentially destroyed in Israel, and so hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled. Many, or 250,000, ended up in Lebanon, and the camp al-Hilweh was originally set up and built to house or home 20,000 people. The population has fluctuated over the years, swelling up to 120,000 at the end, or at the onset of the Syrian civil war, because a lot of Syrians came in and moved into al-Hilweh in 2011. And the camp has sprawled, so it's the borders of the camp very much now within and around the town of Saida, which is a southern city in Lebanon. And so now the camp has about 54,000 Palestinians living in it, in pretty cramped and difficult conditions. But the total population of the camp, we estimate to be around about 70,000. And so the camp itself is self-governed, pretty lawless actually. There was an agreement between the Lebanese army and the Palestinian authorities in 1969 that prevented the Lebanese army from going into the camp. And that was essentially just to allow the Palestinians to have control over the camps, and an agreement that the Palestinians would have a legitimate right to fight Israel from Lebanese lands. Since then, there's been many sort of security incidences, spates of fighting, not least in the Lebanese civil war, when the Israelis invaded and occupied in 1982. There was a lot of intense fighting between them. The camp was essentially razed, and even more fighting following their withdrawal, or during the time of their withdrawal in 1985.
When we say camp, I think people might get an idea in their head like, oh, it's tents and, like that kind of a refugee camp. No, this has been built up for years now. This is essentially a very close quarters, urban, sprawling city, if you like. It reminds me almost of like Kowloon, walled city, but obviously not high up. Like, you know what I'm saying? It's very built up, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, looking at the camp and many of the Palestinian camps, which have been established for quite a long time now, you're looking at two-story concrete buildings, untreated concrete, quite cramped conditions, poor sort of sanitation, poorly irrigated. 90% of Palestinians in camps in Lebanon live in poverty, so they've got minimal means, poor sanitation. But you're right; it's not like when you see camps on the news of people who have just fled Sudan or whatever. It's these are buildings. They have schools, they have hospitals, they have amenities, facilities in the camps, long established. But still pretty desperate conditions. They're not nice places to be.
No, I mean, it's what happens if you just kind of leave a camp for decades, and nothing else changes there, and I guess people just learn to live there. In terms of people controlling it, there's several different factions, Palestinian factions. It's almost like Palestine away from home, if you like, right? Who are the factions there controlling the place?
Yeah, so as you said, there are multiple factions. Each camp will have its own dynamics and different power structures, and different factions will have different powers within the camp. So if we're just talking about al-Hilweh, then and to be honest, most of the camps in Lebanon, the dominant party, the dominant group is Fatah. So the Fatah, for listeners who don't know, is sort of the dominant secular party that makes up a significant amount of the Palestinian Authority. It was founded by Yasser Arafat, who many people will know, have heard of. The current president of the Palestinian Authority is the chairman of Fatah, Mahmoud Abbas. So they are seen as like I guess the most powerful and representative group of Palestinians, particularly in Lebanon. But then you also have other factions vying for power. I'm sure people have heard of Hamas, who control Gaza, who also they see themselves as in opposition to Fatah. They're Islamist, but more like less radical Islamist, but certainly an Islamist party, who also have a lot of support and dominance in the camps, and also in Ain al-Hilweh. And then in Ain al-Hilweh as well, you have lots of smaller Islamist factions, not necessarily Palestinian. As I said, a lot of Syrians and poor Lebanese live in the camps as well, and they will often offer their support to these other factions.
Right, and there's been like straight up ISIS factions in this camp. I remember 5-6 years ago now, they were actually like hanging ISIS flags up in the street, and it wasn't like, oh no, they're just using the black standard. No, it was actual ISIS affiliated groups, and obviously Fatah and other factions have ended up fighting these more jihadi groups for various different reasons. There's been a big flare up of fighting recently. Maybe just explain to us what's happened.
Yeah, so as you're saying, there's been many incidences of fighting over the years, usually different challenges to Fatah's authority, and I think that's essentially what is happening now, or has happened this summer. So at the end of July, there was an attempt that was made on a prominent Islamist militant called Mahmoud Khalil. It failed, but it did kill one of his companions. This was Fatah denied involvement in this, but is widely seen and believed that it was their attempt of removing him. And so the very next day, members of Jund al-Sham, which is a Islamist faction in Ain al-Hilweh, who have clashed with Fatah before, to be honest, they carried out an assassination on a leading Fatah general, Abu Ashraf al-Mushi, killed him and 3 of his bodyguards, videos of which were circulated, and I believe I actually saw them first on Popular Front.
Yeah, it was crazy. It was like really broad daylight assassination, right?
Yeah. Like, and quite, yeah. As you said, it was broad daylight, and it was very much seen as, I think it was done deliberately as a sort of direct challenge to Fatah, like an open broad daylight assassination. And so this sparked the latest clashes that we've seen over the summer, which have happened in 2 different rounds. It's resulted in the deaths of 33 people, 18 in the most recent rounds, over 200 injured, including civilians. In fact, the fighting has gotten so out of hand that stray bullets have landed outside the camp. One has actually killed a Lebanese person inside it. The Lebanese armed forces have also reported injuries to their own personnel with shrapnel wounds. 2,000 people have been displaced, and many have yet to return, to be honest. And so far, it's hard to tell about the scale of the damage that's been done in the camp. But after the first round of fighting at the end of July, UNRWA, RWA, the UN's relief agency for Palestinian refugees, estimated the damages were roughly around $15 million worth, and that's the amount that they were calling for in aid. Although they're likely to ask for more since the most recent clashes.
And so who exactly is fighting who right now?
So we've got these Islamist groups, the largest being Jund al-Sham. they were the ones who carried out the assassination. They've holed themselves up into 2 UN compounds and Fatah. So Fatah, as we've said, is this largest faction. They've been drawing in fighters from across Lebanon, from the different camps, to try and root out and kill. I guess you could say destroy the Islamists. The Islamists, we're thinking there's roughly about 100 of them who are holed up at the moment in the UN compound. So because of the lack of governance and the lack of security in the camps, and as you said, they've even been a haven for the likes of Daesh and ISIS. A lot of these groups, essentially find haven and safety inside al-Hilweh, and so it would be wrong, I think, to believe that these are Islamist Palestinians. It's likely that many of them are Syrian, and many of them are Lebanese as well. The conditions in the camps and the prominence of Islamist factions in there means that the camps are also a haven for recruiting people into these groups. So we can't tell you exactly who's there and who is fighting, but it's believed that it's kind of like there was a rally to arms, a call to arms, and a lot of people have joined Jund al-Sham. There's also been a group called Muslim Youth who have been fighting, but it's likely that they've been rallied together. And as I said, we're looking at about 100 fighters who have been who've been fighting against Fatah. Fatah have been drawing in fighters from across Lebanon to engage.
And so about these ceasefires, there's been 2 ceasefires.
So the first ceasefire, so essentially the ceasefires have been basically agreed under the same conditions. So after the first round of fighting, Fatah, there was a negotiated ceasefire, and Fatah had made a demand of Jund al-Sham to hand over the 8 people that they believe are responsible for the assassination of al-Armushi, and to vacate the compounds of which they're holed up in. These compounds are pretty self-sufficient. They're also home to 8 different schools. So we've got a lot of Palestinian refugees who are not actually in education at the moment. So there really is a kind of an urgency to get them out of there. But it would be on the basis of them handing over the assassins, or who Fatah have said the assassins are, and to vacate the compounds. They didn't do that after the first ceasefire, and so then again, early in this month, September the 7th, fighting resumed, and that resumed for a week, and then after several rounds of negotiations, finally after a negotiation with one of Lebanon's most powerful politicians, he's like the Speaker of the House here. His name's Nabil Berri. He brokered a new ceasefire, but again, it's on the same terms. So Fatah have given Jund al-Sham and the militants until the end of this month, so about 1 week from now, again to hand over the assassins and to vacate. And at the moment, Jund al-Sham and the Islamists are showing absolutely no sign of doing that.
Right, and I do not think they're going to. How strong are each faction? Like, what's the kind of side here? So you've got Fatah. We've seen footage of them firing rockets, shooting, real heavy urban combat. I haven't seen much from the jihadist sides. What's the difference here? Would you say they're equally matched?
No, I wouldn't say so. I think Fatah are vastly they're outnumbering the Islamists. Again, it's hard to say. Fatah are able to draw from across the 12 different Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon. Fighters can be easily moved and deployed. It's just that the Islamists are holed up in these high-walled, easily barricaded compounds, and they're able to survive in there. It's also hard to tell of the deaths of who has fought for who. But it is believed that most of the casualties have been on Fatah's side.
Most of the casualties have been Fatah, yeah.
That's what analysts have said.
Interesting. Well, considering they have more guns and more fighters, why do you think that is?
I mean, I think the general rule of thumb is and you probably have to confirm this for me. I know you've been covering the conflict for a very long time, but in terms of trying to besiege and take over a compound, you're more likely to lose fighters in attempting to do that than defending it. Is my understanding, but I'm not an expert in conflicts. You'd have to tell me.
Well, it's just, I don't know, man. I mean, there's not that much footage from the area, but from what I've seen, it's just been so close quarters combat. It's total urban in very, very narrow alleyways. And I don't know, it just seems like one of the worst possible places to be having kind of open combat like that. I don't know, to be honest. It could just be, that's just, like you said, like it just is how it is. But yeah, weird situation. I imagine Fatah are absolutely furious about this.
Exactly. It's a direct challenge to their authority. And, they've kind of been forced into a position where they really do have to lay down, to lay their mark. They have to assert their authority. They can't really walk away from this now. And as you said, like the conditions in the camp, close combat fighting. You've got a lot of Palestinians, a lot of refugees who are still there. 2,000 have fled, yes, but there are still many who stay there and live there amid the fighting. It's pretty horrible.
Several civilians have been caught in the crossfire, right?
Yes, we've seen many civilians get. Like I think out of we've got the 200 injured. Many of them are civilians.
And what is the Lebanese military's role in all of this? I understand they're outside the camp. Are they inside the camp?
No, yeah. So there was an agreement that was signed in 1969, which basically prevented the Lebanese armed forces from entering into the camps. It was an idea that essentially there was an agreement that the Palestinians have a legitimate right to fight Israel using the camps as a base. So you can't get into the camps. They are patrolled and the gates are manned by the Lebanese armed forces, but the Lebanese armed forces won't go in. There was a spate of fighting in 2007, again, between Islamist factions in a camp in northern Lebanon. I've got to get the pronunciation right of it, Nar al-Barad camp. And the Lebanese forces actually did engage in that, but in doing so, the camp was mostly destroyed. So it created like a humanitarian crisis, put even more strain on the Lebanese state. And so since then, there's been a real reluctance for the Lebanese armed forces to enter and get involved. But they're often, as we've seen over recent weeks, they have threatened to get involved. And Lebanese politicians have been threatening to get involved if the fighting isn't quelled.
Yeah, I saw that, but it seems unlikely they're going to actually do anything. I mean, Lebanese politics right now, it's in an unbelievable state. I can't imagine that it will be in their benefit to actually go in there militarily. I imagine they're kind of thinking, let them kill themselves. As dark as that sounds, I think that's probably what their policy is. Yeah,
exactly. And there's not a huge amount of love for the Palestinian cause, especially amongst the political class in Lebanon. You've got to understand the Palestinians I'm sure were a big part of the Lebanese civil war, the 15.5-year civil war. They were, they maintained arms, they're organized, they're very much part of the sectarian landscape of Lebanon. And so it's very much a delicate balance. I think with all the mess that is in Lebanon and Lebanese politics and the crisis here, it's very much hoped that the Palestinians can resolve this themselves. You've got soldiers in Lebanon, the Lebanese armed forces, who are completely dependent on foreign funding. They've seen their wages shrink from, on average, $800 a month to $100 a month. So they're not particularly keen to go inside and get involved in the fighting either. There's no appetite for that. And equally, in terms of Lebanese views of Palestinians, they're seen as a catalyst of the civil war. And as you've kind of said, there's this whole attitude here of let them fight it out between themselves, let them kill themselves. There's solidarity, and Lebanon is an incredibly complex place with lots of different sects and political views, but there's also a lot of disdain. And in fact, Palestinians as well as Syrians are often scapegoated here for wider economic problems and hardships.
Yeah, I saw online a lot of Lebanese being like, look at these fucking pigs, look what they do in our country. It was very hardcore, very angry that the Palestinians were fighting, which I mean, I can understand why you would be like, hey, can you not caused this. You know what I mean? Civilians are getting killed. It's fucked up. But I was almost like kind of surprised to see the level of just the rage. You could see people were fuming. And I agree with you. I think it was more, I don't want to say this, I'm no expert, but it felt more like that's rage from many different things, placed onto one specific thing. It wasn't just this, if you know what I'm saying.
Absolutely. The methods of power and control and the way that the media is used here to scapegoat minorities and, as I said, particularly Syrians, particularly Palestinians, to deflect from, the accountability that should be laid at the hands of, at the feet of or should be attributed to the leaders here in Lebanon, are often deflected, and the Palestinians are used and the Syrians are used as scapegoats. And so, there's one overarching narrative in Lebanon that the economic crisis here is down to the huge amount, the large amount of refugees that Lebanon is currently hosting. So Lebanon's got a population of just under 6 million, and there's over 1.5 million Syrian refugees here, for instance. So there's this constant scapegoating, constant blaming of refugee populations. And so when you do see flare-ups like this happen, when you do see tension and violence in the camps, or you see, or even if you don't see it, there is this overarching narrative. And so it's quite easy to see how then something like this happens, and then you see expressions of hate and vitriol towards Palestinians online.
Yeah, it's the same all over the world. I mean, refugees, I don't know, they have a fight, and everyone's like, "Oh, get them out," as if they're not just like normal humans as well. You know what I mean? Like, it happens. But this isn't just that. This is like hardcore combat. Where are the Palestinians getting the weapons from? I know the camp is very closed off in some ways, but it must be pretty open for them to be having regular supplies of rocket launchers, hundreds of thousands of rounds of ammunition, rifles. Like, where are they getting their weapon supplies?
Yeah, it's a really good question. There is a big question about how for instance, how both groups are being funded and how they're being armed. So because of essentially the crisis and because of the lack of security or the security failures in Lebanon, the border here between Lebanon and Syria is incredibly porous. So you've got lots of weapons that are coming in from Syria that are being smuggled in. And obviously weapons are absolutely everywhere in Syria. So it really doesn't take, it would be too difficult for an Islamist faction to get their hands on, military grade weapons, rocket propelled grenades, which we've seen a lot of, and heavier machine guns. So there is easy access to weapons here. In terms of funding, that is also incredibly hard to prove. It's very hard to get any kind of evidence about who is directly supporting the Islamists, for instance. I would say, and this is not me having presented any evidence, but it's quite difficult to move large weapons in Lebanon without permission from certain larger political organizations here. I can't really name any names because I don't want to be called out on it. One thing that a lot of analysts have said is that, for instance, Hamas, who is Fatah's biggest opposition, they would absolutely be seen to benefit from this conflict. And that's not to say that they're fueling it. They've been very public in calling for ceasefires and calling for an end to the conflict, and even in some ways offering support, just verbally at least, for Fatah. But they are, it's quite clear that this direct challenge to Fatah is going to benefit Hamas, and we've already seen, for instance, joint security forces, like a joint security force agreement between Fatah and Hamas, which is likely, it could well play out that Hamas get more security authority within al-Hilweh and other camps as a result of this fighting, as an example. So that's not me saying that Hamas are supporting or fueling or funding the militants. There are many people who are accusing them of doing that. But that is just something to be thinking about in terms of the wider political significance of this conflict.
Yeah, I mean, it's not outrageous. It would make a lot of sense if Hamas did that, okay, they say one thing, but I mean, politics in general, nobody really says what they mean. So no, I can definitely see that. That is interesting. So Fatah have given this jihadist faction to the end of the month to hand over the shooter, essentially, right? That's the end of this month, is that right?
Yep. So the end of September. So from today, that's another week.
Today is the 24th. There's not many days left in September. Highly unlikely this guy is going to be handed over. What's going to happen then? I mean, Fatah are just going to roll up to their offices and start shooting. Like, I know there's like this ultimatum, but have they given any idea of what will happen then? I imagine it's just going to be more fighting.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the Islamists have shown absolutely no sign of surrendering themselves, nor the people who Fatah have demanded as seeing as responsible for the assassination. They've also stayed embedded in the compound. So discussions are ongoing. I think Fatah are unlikely to back down on this. They see Islamists as a direct challenge to their authority. So I do think it's likely that we'll see continued fighting. I think it's likely we'll see Fatah calling in for more support from fighters from other camps until either a new ceasefire will be agreed or they're able to breach the compounds and root out the Islamists. Talking about this conflict, it's important to say that we're likely to see essentially the same continued misery and suffering for the inhabitants of the camp who we have spoken to. I've spoken to them, and they don't actually have anywhere else to go. Most of them, so they'll come out and they'll be camped outside the compounds or in a mosque or sent to schools and other buildings in the area. So it's not looking great.
Just until the combat dies down.
Yeah, until it does. But even now we've got a ceasefire, and many of them haven't returned because they say that they're just waiting for it to happen again. So why would they go back if they know that it could break out at any moment, and then their lives would be at risk again?
It's horrible. So Fatah, obviously, they have the majority of fighters. They have the executive force. They have more firearms. But in terms of political situations, how influential are Fatah? Do they run the place? Do they control the place that way? Or is it still very split?
So, yes, in terms of al-Hilweh, Fatah is still the dominant faction, and they have been for a long time in al-Hilweh. It's obviously very hard to gauge in terms of how much democratic support they have from the inhabitants of the camp. There's very little in terms of open democratic processes or referendums or anything like that. So in that sense, it's very hard to gauge, but they are supported still within the camp. It's a very difficult position they're put in, because obviously if they give in fighting, give in to the Islamists, or if they back down on their demands in any kind of way, they're seen as weak. And if they continue fighting as the dominant power, they're seen as destructive. So they're put in a very difficult position, and you could probably imagine that they have lost some support as a result of that.
Yeah, I imagine. In terms of Hamas, how much power would they have there? Do you think that perhaps this might turn people towards Hamas or the more jihadist factions just based on, Fatah started this or whatever, or stability, or what's like, surely someone else is gaining from this if Fatah is losing some kind of grip?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, obviously Hamas, the Islamists, they've always seen themselves and have always positioned themselves as the main opposition to Fatah. They're the main opposition as well to the signing of the Oslo Accords, which they see as like a bit of a shit deal for the Palestinians, and obviously in direct opposition to Fatah, who they accuse of being too close to the Israeli state, for instance, and their involvement in security coordination. So yeah, many analysts have said that they believe that Hamas could well be fueling this as a way of destabilizing the authority of Fatah. Hamas already do have a lot of support in the camps. They are, you could probably describe them accurately as the second most dominant faction, and so it's likely that they could could gain more support. I think ideologically they are different groups. Fatah is a secular, seen as more democratic, and there are other political groups as well within the camp who are secular, leftist, if you like, but would be more closely aligned to Fatah, whereas Hamas are sort of moderate Islamists, and they could well appeal to people who see Fatah as not being strong enough and weak, if you like.
Yeah, I remember I think it's going to get complicated, but I think there's both PFLP General Command fighters who also have a unit in Syria, and there's also DFLP, so Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine fighters, like kind of an offshoot. I remember about 5 or 6 years ago reading a story where the DFLP were one of the main groups that were kind of patrolling the area, acting as police almost, although not necessarily involved in crimes and that, but just kind of security forces. What's the situation like now? How does this place actually, how is it policed? If there's all these different factions, does each faction have its own area that it patrols, or does Fatah have the majority of like police and security forces patrolling? How does it work?
There's been this discussion that's been going on about this joint security force that would see essentially a bit of a power share between Fatah and various other Palestinian factions, particularly in al-Hilweh. And in fact, today they've begun deploying. Can send you the article if you like. I'm not keenly aware on exactly how who patrols what area, and whether it's like sections of the camp that are patrolled by particular groups, or if it's done another way, whether it's geographical or hierarchical or anything like that.
Sure, but they're saying now there's like a joint security force, basically.
Yeah, which was they're began deploying this morning, and so it's within that security force which you're likely now to see more Hamas involvement, and so this would be potentially Fatah giving way more power to Hamas, or people who would see Hamas as a more representative of them.
Where can people find your work, mate?
Yeah, so I'm a video journalist for The National, so on the nationalnews.com. I've also got a website, mattkynaston.com, MATTKYNASTON, and you can find me on Twitter and Instagram, or X, I guess, formerly known as Twitter, which we say now, right?
X, I know. What is wrong with it? It will always just be Twitter, man. All right, mate, thank you very much for that. Hopefully things get better in the camp.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure, Jake. Thank you so much, and all the best.
Cheers, man. Bye. That was the Popular Front podcast. If you want more exclusive bonus episodes, extra video content, access to the Popular Front network, and more, subscribe to patreon.com/popularfront. We're entirely independent and grassroots. Nobody owns us. Patreon keeps us going, as does our merchandise. You can get Popular Front apparel and accessories at www.popularfront.shop. You can also buy our various publications there, like the Popular Front magazine, which is available now. We're censored on social media and streaming platforms, so please do follow us and share our content. Watch our documentaries at youtube.com/popularfront. Follow us on Instagram at popular.front, Twitter at popularfront_. And for uncensored updates on the world at war, follow our Telegram at popularxfront. If you want to keep track of my work, it's the same on all socials at Jake_Hanrahan, HANRAHAN. For all those links, go to www.popularfront.co. The music in this episode was produced by Sam Black. Check him out at samblackpf.com or search Sam Black PF on Spotify. Intro music is by Home. Thank you to this episode's sponsors. This episode was sponsored by Propagandopolis, an outlet selling and writing about historical conflict propaganda from around the world. You can buy prints at propagandopolis.com. Use a promo code POPULARFRONT10 for 10% off. This episode was also sponsored by Oracle Coffee Shop in Portland, Oregon, USA. They're an independent coffee business selling only fair trade products. See them at 3875 Southwest, Bond Avenue 97239. Let them know that Popular Front sent you, and you will get a discount of some kind on your coffee there. Thank you to the high tier Patreons: Evan Kale, Peter Cherry, Lupe Calderon Garnica, Cyril Geist, Thomas Giuseppe, Jake Fuentes, Viola Forvel, Christian Bustamante, Daniel Verdin, Margosha, Rohan Irvin, Ryan Barbadillo, VS, Brian R, Justin Katuna, Evan Pank, Bradley Hope, Wizard Actual, Benjamin Tupper, Chongus Bongwater, Siddhartha O, Damien, Cameron Collins, Matthew Diffley, Claire, Liana, Robert, Sean, Christianovich, NTHG, Attiro Rafael Macias, Ethan Schwick, Peter Nybratton, Gabriel K, AG Barcelona, David McManus, Tom Petrie, James Leons, Bradley Davies, No Dogs No Hamsters, Brendan Crave, B, Dallas Don, LD50 Seattle, Adam H, B Rambo, Larson, Ivan Julien, Björn Kirsten, Diamondstein, Michael O'Connor, Nicholas Butter, JD, James Karpinski, Jav, James Cully, Ethan, Fitzmadrid, Ed Coulthard, D San, Mike Barone, Scott Hopton, Liam Williams, DZA, Jojo Arani, Vegan Straight Edge Global Cabal, Amy R, Rubicon, Frank Austin, Amelia, me, Michael, Neck, Freya Northman, Neba, Noah, Andrew Hurley, Vida Provost, Bike Lane Bowser, Brian McLaughlin, Tom Lochran, Young Wasabi, Tony Bin, JL, Stephen Davila, Chad Walker, What Bitcoin Did with Peter McCormick, Christopher Martin, Ryan Sandercock, and Moritz Zumbor.